I think that there is at least now 100 countries in the world which have problems with some kind of separation movement. But only this country is bombed by strongest and most powerful war machinery ever existed in the world. And who will gain a glory with all those powerful and high technology ruining one small independent country member of UN? And what will the world look like after that practice? Every country, every people has a right to live in freedom, not to be occupied or terrorized by superpowers who will tell them how to live, what to do, what to think, and how to behave. Through all our history, there is no one generation who was not fighting for freedom. And we were always conquered by empires, by very big empires. Ottoman empires, or Austro-Hungarian empires, or Hitler, big war machinery. But every time we liberated our country. And that is what we are doing now.
Hello friends and subscribers, and welcome to another Quintessential Retrospective. A little over a year ago, in February of 2018, I did a retrospective on the separation of Kosovo from Serbia for its 10th anniversary. And for this one, we are returning to familiar territory, this time considering the 1998 to 1999 conflict in Kosovo that led to the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia and paved the way for the subsequent separation of Kosovo from Serbia. In these retrospectives, I begin with the lead-up to the event in question, the event itself, and what happened as a result. So in order to avoid not making just two of the same video that I made last year, there are certain things I talked about in that video I will not discuss here, and there will be some things here that I did not discuss in that one which will be brought up in this video. Although I mentioned the bombing in that video, I did not go into much detail. This video will be the opposite of that, so let us begin. If you saw my previous video, then you will know that on this day, 20 years ago on March 24th, 1999, the United States led the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO's, campaign of military intervention against the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. NATO claimed it was aimed at bringing an end to the conflict between the Yugoslav government led by Slobodan Milosevic and ethnic Albanian guerrillas in the province of Kosovo to prevent ethnic cleansing and/or genocide, fearing a repeat of the atrocities that played out in the previous Yugoslav conflicts earlier in the 90s, following the breakup of socialist Yugoslavia. The campaign ended after 78 days, with the Yugoslav government agreeing to withdraw its forces and make way for international peacekeepers, but only if the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia's territorial integrity was upheld, and the forces would be under the authority of the United Nations and not NATO. The conflict was controversial for all parties involved for its time, mainly due to the fact that NATO did not have the authorization from the United Nations Security Council, and to this day still remains a controversial topic for describing the post-Cold War foreign policy of the United States and post-Cold War purpose of NATO, and how ethnic and territorial conflicts are resolved. However, most of the controversy surrounding the bombing would later become overshadowed by the fallout from the Iraq War, which took place 4 years later, a conflict I also previously covered. So, in order to get the full context of what happened back in 1999, we will need to look back at both the histories of Yugoslavia and NATO itself. Although at one point the two's history will become intertwined. We will also have to look back at the many significant events that predate the bombing that started in the spring of 1999. First, let's start off with NATO. NATO was originally a defensive military alliance formed in April of 1949 between the United States, Canada, Britain, France, Norway, and several other countries that would come to each other's aid if any one of these countries was attacked by the Soviet Union or another communist state. NATO's doctrine was an attack on one was an attack on all. It's also worth noting that NATO's founding predates the founding of the Warsaw Pact by several years. The Warsaw Pact being an alliance of the communist states of Eastern Europe, known as the Eastern Bloc. NATO further saw members joining the alliance after its founding. Turkey and Greece joined the alliance in 1952, and then West Germany joined in 1955. Spain then joined in 1982. By the late 80s, communism in Eastern Europe, including Yugoslavia, started to become extremely unpopular, and in 1989, most Eastern Bloc countries had mass protests demanding the end of communist rule. The most notable of these revolutions was the fall of the Berlin Wall in November of 1989. Its collapse symbolized the end of the Cold War and the demise of communism, as there was no East and West Germany anymore, only one Germany. Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev allowed the reunification of Germany on the strict condition that the alliance would not move eastward and expand into Eastern Europe. A year later, by the end of 1991, the Soviet Union itself collapsed and the Russian Federation was born. And with the Soviet Union's collapse, the United States became the world's only superpower, and with the Warsaw Pact dissolved, there was effectively no other military alliance on Earth that could seriously challenge the power and presence of NATO. It had seemed NATO had outlived its intended purpose, to deter the threat of communist aggression against the liberal democracies of Western Europe. But the alliance continued to exist, and its post-Cold War role will be formed in the decade to come. And a part of that role would be discovered in the events that would take place among the violent breakup of Yugoslavia in the 1990s. As for Yugoslavia's background, I detailed the history of Yugoslavia in my first video on Kosovo, on how it was a pan-Slavic kingdom formed after World War I. It was invaded and divided in World War II, and then put back together as a socialist federation after the war led by Marshal Josip Broz Tito. Yugoslavia had 6 constituent republics: Croatia, Bosnia, Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia, and Slovenia. Despite being a communist federation, Yugoslavia was not allied with the Soviet Union and became one of the founding members of the non-aligned movement in 1961. But it was ultimately in the 80s that ethnic tension and unease started to grow after Tito's death, among other factors such as high unemployment and inflation, which turned out to be recipes for disaster. The problems impacting Yugoslavia culminated in the violent breakup of the country with the Yugoslav wars in the early 90s, with one 10-day war in Slovenia in June and July 1991, a 4-year war in Croatia from 1991 to 1995, and a 3-year war in Bosnia from 1992 to 1995. And then the peaceful exit of Macedonia in September 1991. Only Serbia and Montenegro agreed to form an unofficial third Yugoslav state known as the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia in 1992. Like how socialist Yugoslavia was mostly dominated by one man, Marshal Tito, for most of its life, the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia would be dominated by one man throughout most of its life as well, Serbian President Slobodan Milosevic. The nature of the Yugoslav wars is controversial. They were Europe's deadliest conflict since World War II, and became infamous for the violent atrocities that would characterize them. These wars are the origins of the terms ethnic cleansing and Balkanization, and this is where NATO found its first use following the end of the Cold War. In April 1993, the United Nations established a no-fly zone over Bosnia, and NATO aircraft were used to enforce what is known as Operation Deny Flight. The UN also authorized NATO to use their aircraft to protect UN peacekeepers in the region. NATO even saw its first combat operations during the Bosnian War. On February 28, 1994, 4 US F-16s shot down several Bosnian Serb aircraft over the city of Banja Luka for violating the no-fly zone. NATO's operations further culminated in August of 1995. On July 11th of 1995, the Bosnian Serb army led by Ratko Mladic overran the UN safe zone of Srebrenica, and for the next 10 days estimated to have killed up to 8,000 Bosniak men and boys. In response to the massacre, Bosnian Serb threats against UN safe zones, and the continued shelling of the Bosnian capital Sarajevo, NATO intensified its bombing campaign against Bosnian Serb military targets, forcing them to return to the diplomacy table. In December 1995, the war ended with a Dayton Agreement, which internally partitioned Bosnia between the Serbs in Republika Srpska and the Bosnians and Croats in the Federation of Bosnia. The agreement was signed between Bosnian President Alija Izetbegovic, Croatian President Franjo Tudjman, signing on behalf of the Bosnian Croats, and Serbian President Slobodan Milosevic, signing on behalf of the Bosnian Serbs. The agreement also established NATO peacekeepers to enter Bosnia and oversee the agreement's implementation. And so it would seem peace would return to the Balkans. And I know what many of you are probably thinking. That was a lot of information, but how come it barely mentioned Kosovo at all? How does this all relate to the events in Kosovo in 1999? Well, NATO's mission in Bosnia would form the basis of what its perceived mission would be in Kosovo 4 years later. as well as the additional formation of the post-Cold War doctrine of humanitarian intervention. In Kosovo, things played out differently, but still all connected to the breakup of Yugoslavia. In the previous video, I mentioned that Kosovo was seen as the heart of Serbia, the cradle of its very foundation being part of the first medieval Serbian state and the Serbian Empire. It was in the year 1389, the Battle of Kosovo took place between the Serbian Empire and the Ottoman Turks. In that battle, the Turks won and the Serbian Empire was defeated, and for the next few centuries, the region would fall under Ottoman Turkish rule. During that time, Kosovo became a province of the Ottoman Empire, and the Albanians gradually became the majority of its population. In the aftermath of the First Balkan Wars in the early 19-teens, Kosovo once again fell into Serbian sovereignty, but the Albanians still continued to see their population expand amongst ethnic tension that began since the late 19th century. In World War II, when Yugoslavia was invaded and dismembered, Kosovo, as well as parts of Montenegro, Serbia, and Macedonia, were annexed into Greater Albania, a protectorate of fascist Italy. After the war, the region was returned to Yugoslavia and became one of the two autonomous provinces of Serbia, the other being Vojvodina in the north. Under Tito's policy of brotherhood and unity, ethnic nationalism was suppressed, while ethnic cooperation was encouraged, reminding Serbs and Kosovar Albanians of the close cooperation of Ramiz Siriku, a Kosovar Albanian, and Boro Vukimirovic, a Kosovar Serb. Two high-ranking officials in the Yugoslav partisans who worked closely together in the anti-fascist struggle in Yugoslavia during World War II, who were both captured and killed by the Italians and fascist Albanians in April of 1943. In the late 60s and early 70s, several protest movements broke out in Yugoslavia, such as the 1968 protests against the unpopular economic reforms, and the 1971 Croatian Spring that demanded greater rights and autonomy for Croatia. In 1974, a new constitution was enacted that brought forth a more decentralized Yugoslavia, as opposed to the previously centralized system favored mostly by the Serbs. The new constitution also granted greater powers and autonomy to the constituent republics, as well as the autonomous provinces of Serbia, bringing them almost on par with the republics, such as granting them a vote in the collective presidency. These moves outraged the Serbs as they no longer had any meaningful control over their provinces. The Albanian population continued to increase due to the high birth rates, and Serbs continued to leave Kosovo as a result of claims of discrimination and the lack of economic prosperity. In spring 1981, a series of student protests and riots broke out in Kosovo, who demanded that the province be upgraded to the status of republic, with the goal in mind to secede from Yugoslavia and join Albania. Although these were suppressed by the Yugoslav People's Army, these would herald the collapse of things to come, and tensions would later rise in Kosovo and Yugoslavia later on. 2 years later, Aleksandar Rankovic, the most beloved Serb partisan, died in his home in Dubrovnik, Croatia. Rankovic was known as an advocate of a centralized Yugoslavia, and he distrusted the Albanians of Kosovo. While he had basically been made an unperson by the government since his fall from power in 1966, he is still widely admired and loved by the Serbs as a great hero to their nation. His funeral was attended by 100,000 people, including the unknown civil servant at the time, Slobodan Milosevic. Milosevic's policies later on were said to be inspired by Rankovic's. Milosevic would make a name for himself 4 years later in April of 1987. The Serbian branch of the League of Communists dispatched an envoy of its members, which included Milosevic as a member, to go to Kosovo and hear out complaints from the Kosovar Serbs regarding the ethnic tensions in Kosovo. On April 24th, while meeting with Kosovo Serb leaders at the cultural center near Kosovo Polje, Serb protesters clashed with the Albanian police just outside. Some of the protesters accused the police of brutality, including beating some of them. When meeting with these people, Milosevic was famously videotaped telling them that no one would beat them again. The exact translation has been somewhat controversial, with some translations claiming he went so far as to boldly proclaim, "No one shall dare to beat you ever again," while Milosevic and others suggested a more innocuous translation of, "No one should be beaten," or "You will not be beaten." Later that year, Milosevic had a falling out with his former friend and mentor, Ivan Stambolic. In 1988 and 1989, Milosevic and his supporters launched the Anti-Bureaucratic Revolution, a series of street protests which forced the leadership of Vojvodina, Montenegro, and Kosovo to resign and be replaced with politicians more closely aligned with Serbia and Milosevic. This allowed for the revision of the constitution and allowed Serbia to regain control of the provinces by reducing their autonomy. A minor strike took place in Kosovo where the miners went on a hunger strike to protest the reduction of Kosovo's autonomy. The strike ended when members of the Special Anti-Terrorist Unit stormed the mine and arrested the miners. Not long after that, Kosovo's autonomy was effectively abolished. Months later, on June 28, 1989, to commemorate the 600th anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo between the Serbian and Ottoman empires, Milosevic made his official Gemiston speech, where he proudly proclaimed that Serbia was once again on the path towards greatness.
Nesloga srpskih političara unazađivala je Srbiju, a njihova inferiornost ponižavala je Srbiju. Tako je bilo decenijama, godinama. Evo nas danas na polju Kosovu da kažemo da više nije tako. Nema zato u Srbiji pogodnijeg mesta od polja Kosova da se to kaže. I nema zato u Srbiji pogodnijeg mesta od polja Kosova da se kaže da će sloga u Srbiji omogućiti prosperitet i srpskom narodu, i Srbiji, i svakom njenom građaninu bez obzira na nacionalnu ili versku pripadnost. Srbija je danas jedinstvena, ravnopravna sa drugim republikama i spremna da učini sve da poboljša svoj materijalni i društveni položaj svih svojih građana. Ako bude sloge, saradnje i ozbiljnosti, ona će u tome i uspeti. Zato je optimizam koji je danas prisutan u Srbiji u pogledu budućih dana realan utoliko što se zasniva na slobodi koja omogućava svim ljudima da izraze svoje pozitivne, stvaralačke, humane sposobnosti za unapređenje društvenog i sopstvenog života.
The attendees on this list was impressive, such as the then Montenegrin president Momir Bulatovic and future and current president of Montenegro Milo Đukanovic, the final socialist Yugoslav prime minister Ante Markovic, Serbian Archbishop German II, and providing security was Nasser Oric, a future notorious Bosnian Muslim warlord. The only notable foreign dignitary to attend was the Turkish ambassador to Yugoslavia, Erdogan Tevfik Ayunidin. The Turks had an interest in the event as the Republic of Turkey is the successor state to the Ottoman Empire. It was also in 1989 that Slobodan Milosevic eventually became the president of Serbia himself. In 1990, after the League of Communists of Yugoslavia disbanded, each of the Republican branches reformed into more moderate parties. Slobodan Milosevic merged the League of Communists of Serbia with the Socialist Alliance of Working People and formed the Socialist Party of Serbia. In the December 1990 general elections, Milosevic was elected to the Serbian presidency with 65% of the vote, and the Socialist Party of Serbia won a supermajority with 194 out of 250 seats in the parliament. From 1991 to 1992, Yugoslavia went through its initial violent breakup. Although Serbia itself did not partake in any of these wars, the seeds of unrest in Kosovo have been planted and were the beginning to sprout. In 1991, as the rest of Yugoslavia was breaking away, Albanian separatism in Kosovo began to rise. Two paths were formed, a non-violent one called the Republic of Kosovo, led by Ibrahim Rugova, which sought to establish parallel institutions not subject to the Serb authorities, and a violent one formed by Adem Jashari, who formed the Kosovo Liberation Army, or the KLA or UCK, a terroristic Albanian nationalist paramilitary that would seek armed struggle in order to have Kosovo break away from Serbia and form Greater Albania. However, in its early years, the group had only a couple dozen members and carried out limited acts of sabotage in 1991. Jashari was nearly arrested in December 1991 by the Serbian police in the town of Prikaz, but crowds of Albanians showed up to protest and pressured the authorities to withdraw. Later, Jashari and 100 others went to Albania to receive military training. Throughout the 90s, the KLA would receive covert support from the Western intelligence agencies in order to bring about armed rebellion in Kosovo to provoke a harsh Serbian counterinsurgency so NATO could later intervene and sever the province from Serbia and further expand Western influence and American hegemony in the Balkans and Eastern Europe as a whole. In 1995, the KLA carried out its first attacks on Serbian law enforcement in Kosovo, but its name would not be known until 1996 when it began a low-intensity armored campaign. In 1997, the government of Sali Berisha in Albania collapsed among widespread unrest against government corruption and pyramid schemes. Many of the Albanians' military armories were looted, and many of these arms ended up into the arms of the KLA militants, allowing them to increase the intensity of their armed campaign. They also began to fund their campaign through drug trafficking and via donations from the Albanian diaspora. In July 1997, Slobodan Milosevic, having spent the maximum afforded 2 terms as the president of Serbia, then assumed the Federal Yugoslav presidency. Milan Milutinovic then became president of Serbia after Milosevic. The events that led to the NATO bombing of 1999 would come about in the following year in March of 1998. In late February and early March 1998, the KLA ambushed several police patrols around Prikaz, leading police to pursue the militants in the surrounding villages of Lukosane and Shirez in the Drenica region of Kosovo. Drenica was the main KLA stronghold prior to the war and held a heavy KLA presence. Jashari himself participated in these attacks and later escaped. After the operations in Lukosane and Shirez, the Serbian police and anti-terrorist units and Yugoslav army proceeded to Adam Jashari's family compound on March 5, 1998. When they arrived, the police gave Jashari and his family 2 hours to surrender. Before the time limit expired, most civilians complied, but Jashari and his family refused and chose the martyrs route by attacking the Serbian authorities, who in the pursuing battle killed Jashari and several dozen members of his family. Despite Jashari's death, he became a martyr in the eyes of the Kosovo Albanians, and his death became a rallying cry for rebellion against the Serb authorities in Kosovo. The operations on the Jashari compound also led to a backlash from the international community, predictably from the United States, who then Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, was already spoiling for war against Yugoslavia, a whole year before the actual bombing began.
By his actions in Kosovo, Slobodan Milosevic has made it clear that he is spurning the incentives that the United States and others have offered him in recent weeks. Unfortunately, the one thing he truly understands is decisive and firm action on the part of the international community. We have already taken steps to ensure that Serbia pays a price for its conduct in Kosovo, and we are urging our allies to follow suit at the contact group meeting on Monday. We are not going to tolerate any return to the politics of divide and rule anywhere in the former Yugoslavia. We are not going to stand by and watch the Serbian authorities do in Kosovo what they can no longer get away with doing in Bosnia.
Weeks later, on March 30th, 1998, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 1160, which imposed an arms embargo on the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. The resolution also allowed the international monitors into Kosovo to monitor the conflict and allow humanitarian organizations into the region as well. In spring 1998, the KLA insurgency became high intensity, as the group's numbers grew, allowing them to control up to about a third of the territory in Kosovo. Many say even as far as up to half of it. The KLA's first strategy was to connect the regions of Drenica to North Albania to maintain an arms supply flow. In turn, the Yugoslav government authorized a special police unit under control of the Interior Ministry and the Yugoslav military to crack down on the Albanian insurgents in Kosovo. They were aided by the paramilitaries and state security forces such as the Special Operations Unit, or Red Berets, led by Milorad Ulemek. With foreign powers eyeing the conflict in Kosovo, a public referendum on foreign interference on the conflict was held on April 23, 1998, with Kosovo Albanians boycotting the referendum, as they have consistently done since the late 80s. The Serbian people overwhelmingly rejected foreign interference by more than 95%, with a 75% voter turnout. In June 1998, U.S. diplomat Richard Holbrooke met with Slobodan Milosevic to encourage him to seek a diplomatic solution to the conflict. Later, he was famously photographed with the UCK, confirming that the U.S. backed them against Belgrade, despite the U.S. at this point still regarding the KLA as a terrorist organization. In fact, in the same month, the KLA took control of the Beličević mine, a coal mine that supplied most of the region's power plants. The KLA took 9 Kosovar Serb miners as hostages. After a failed negotiation with the Serb authorities, the Serbian police and Yugoslav army slowly advanced on the mine and took it within a week. However, the hostages were never found and are presumed dead. In July 1998, the Serbian forces were able to launch several successful counterinsurgency operations that put the KLA on the defensive. The escalation caused further threats from NATO about possible intervention, including an air show in August 1998 where NATO aircraft flew within a few miles of the airspace above Montenegro. In late September 1998, one of the first major Serb atrocities of the war occurred. On September 25th, a police vehicle near Gornje Obirne was blown up, killing 5 policemen, in an area where heavy fighting between KLA and the Yugoslav army was occurring. The next day, on September 26th, the Serbian police murdered 21 members of the Dalija family and 14 arbitrarily selected men from the nearby villages. In response to this, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 1199 in September 1998 and Resolution 1203 in October 1998, both of which called on both sides to adhere to a ceasefire, for the KLA to cease terrorist activity, and for Milosevic's government to pursue a peaceful resolution to the conflict. It also established further diplomatic and verification missions in Kosovo. NATO was ready to begin airstrikes within 96 hours if Yugoslavia did not comply with the ceasefire, to which it did, even partially withdrawing its reservist units and heavy weaponry of the Yugoslav military from Kosovo, as the KLA had been routed by fall of 1998. However, the ceasefire collapsed just 2 months later in December 1998, as the KLA had decided to bide their time, regrouping, rearming, and preparing for renewed clashes. On December 3rd of 1998, several KLA militants were killed attempting to cross the Yugoslav border through Albania by Yugoslav border troops. Almost 2 weeks later, on December 14th, 1998, 36 KLA militants were killed in an ambush along the Albanian border attempting to smuggle weapons into Kosovo. Hours later, 2 suspected KLA gunmen entered the Panda Bar Cafe in Peć and shot and killed 6 Serbian teenagers. Although the KLA was blamed, they denied the attack. Speculation for who was responsible has varied, from the KLA itself, a rogue unit of the KLA, unaffiliated Albanian radicals, or possibly the JSO and a false flag, as alleged by the Serbian tabloid Courier, although no solid evidence for the latter has yet to emerge. Regardless, the conflict resumed in December of 1998. But it was in the next month of January 1999 that the point of no return on NATO's decision to intervene in the conflict conveniently arrived. According to the KLA and NATO narrative, on January 15, 1999, Serbian police entered the village of Račak and murdered 45 civilians, including 20 of whom were rounded up, brought to a ravine, and then executed. William Walker, the head of the Kosovo verification mission, came to Račak the next day on January 16th and gave a press conference accusing the Serbs of having mercilessly carried out a massacre of civilians, but we'll come back to this point in a bit. The incident at Račak prompted NATO to insist that Milosevic withdraw all Serbian and Yugoslav forces from Kosovo and replace them with NATO peacekeepers, something that Milosevic and the Serbs were adamantly against. Even so, Bill Clinton repeatedly warned Yugoslavia that the US was serious about intervening. And so in February and March 1999, a series of talks were held at Rambouillet in France. However, these were anything but talks. For one, the Serbs and Albanians never held any direct talks or negotiations at Rambouillet. Both sides had to speak through NATO mediators. The final accords called upon Yugoslavia to withdraw its forces from Kosovo and allow in NATO peacekeepers, and allow NATO forces to establish Kosovo as a NATO protectorate, and further called upon Yugoslavia to allow its forces to move throughout all of Yugoslavia unhindered and immune from Yugoslav law. The Serbs found these terms to be too outrageous to agree to, and the Serbs presented their own several counteroffers, insisting on unarmed UN observers, but these were also rejected by NATO and the Albanians. NATO warned the failure to sign the Rambouillet Accords would result in bombing. Yugoslavia refused to sign, and with all diplomatic means declined by March 23, 1999, NATO decided to aggressively bomb Yugoslavia in order for them to end their counterinsurgency operations in Kosovo. Shortly after midnight on March 24, 1999, the bombing campaign began, dubbed Operation Allied Force.
My fellow Americans, today our armed forces joined our NATO allies in airstrikes against Serbian forces responsible for the brutality in Kosovo. We have acted with resolve for several reasons. We act to protect thousands of innocent people in Kosovo from a mounting military offensive. We act to prevent a wider war, to defuse a powder keg at the heart of Europe that has exploded twice before in this century with catastrophic results. And we act to stand united with our allies for peace. By acting now, we are upholding our values, protecting our interests, and advancing the cause of peace.
Since Yugoslavia's anti-air defenses were determined to be outdated and obsolete, in addition to the sheer aerial power of the alliance, the bombing campaign was expected to last no more than a few days at the most, with the first few NATO air attacks striking targets in Belgrade, Serbia, the capital of Yugoslavia, in the first few hours of March 24th, 1999. Like the invasion of Iraq that would take place 4 years later, and unlike previous NATO interventions in Bosnia, NATO's bombing campaign did not have clearance from the United Nations Security Council and therefore violated international law. But many notable events happened during the NATO bombing. NATO claimed it intervened in order to end Yugoslav atrocities against the Albanians, yet as soon as bombs fell, most of the anti-Albanian massacres occurred after the bombing began, especially within the first few days after it began, such as the Bela Šervić massacre, the Suva Reka massacre, and the Velika Kruja massacre, in which 90 Kosovar Albanian men were killed. It wasn't until after the bombing began did the mass exodus of Albanians fleeing Kosovo begin. A few days after the bombing began, the one and only instance to date of a stealth fighter being shot down occurred. The Serbs figured out stealth aircraft could be detected on their outdated Soviet radars if they were recalibrated for longer wavelengths. And on March 27th, the 250th Air Defense Missile Brigade fired an SA-03 Goa surface-to-air missile at an American F-117 Nighthawk. The aircraft was down near Belgrade, and the pilot, Daryl Zelko, was able to parachute and hid in a drain for nearly 8 hours as Serbian police, Yugoslav soldiers, and civilians looked for him. He was later rescued by a search and rescue operations team. Interestingly, Zelko was a Yugoslav American, and later met and befriended Zoltan Dani, the soldier who shot him down. When the plane's wreck was found, it was broadcasted all over Serbian television, with pieces of it ending up as souvenirs, one of them to the Serbian warlord, Arkan.
Well, I have a piece of that plane. It's a rubber, you know. I can show you. It's only a rubber. That's a piece from exactly from that plane. I keep that as a souvenir. You can see you see, I can break it. It's a rubber. You know, they send on some of those televisions that when they shut down our plane 29, MiG-29, they said this is a message to Slobodan Milosevic when they shut down the plane. Well, now we shut this plane and I will send a message to Bill Clinton. This is a message to Bill Clinton. Don't quarrel with Serbs, ever.
The wreckage was later displayed at the Belgrade Aviation Museum. The shoot-down became immortalized in the propaganda flyer, "Sorry, we didn't know the plane was invisible." Anyway, the bombing still carried on in cities like Belgrade and Novi Sad, whose skylines were in flames on a nightly basis as a result of the NATO air raids. For the first time in over 55 years, Belgrade was the target of German and American bombs yet again since World War II. And while the bombing was expected to last no more than a few days, with NATO's strategy hitting a few key military targets, the Balkans were experiencing bad weather at this time, and many NATO aircraft missed their targets, resulting in minimal damage and enemy casualties. They also gravely underestimated Milosevic's will to resist. And contrary to NATO's hopes that the bombing would last a few days, it continued into April 1999, and some of the most controversial incidents of the bombing occurred that month. The first being the bombing of Novi Sad, where bridges and oil refineries were being bombed. On April 12th, on a bridge near Grdelica, NATO aircraft bombed the Grdelica bridge as a train passed over it. Twice. Anywhere from 20 to 60 civilians were killed during the event. Things further went badly when NATO bombed a convoy of Albanian refugees, killing 73 of them 2 days later, and then bombed a refugee camp a week later. But another controversial aspect of the bombing was NATO's decision to bomb the radio, television, and Serbia headquarters in Belgrade on April 23, 1999. During the war, NATO decided that RTS and other TV stations became legitimate targets of war because they were quote-unquote propaganda outlets.
These television stations are part of the apparatus of dictatorship and power of Milosevic.
Noam Chomsky opined that this was an act of terrorism as, according to him, Before the attack, NATO said it would not target the building if it broadcasted 6 hours worth of NATO propaganda. When it declined, it was attacked shortly afterwards, which is why the station manager, Dragoljub Milanovic, was later found guilty for failing to evacuate it. The French government was opposed to targeting the RTS, which is noble, as Noam Chomsky would point out years later, while the attack on RTS was cheered. After the Charlie Hebdo attacks of 2015, they were condemned as an act of violence against journalists. But if we followed NATO's logic, the attack on Charlie Hebdo was justified because the terrorists could claim their blasphemous Muhammad cartoons were anti-Muslim propaganda. NATO would continue to bomb other TV stations throughout Yugoslavia in the aftermath. Things would get worse in early May when NATO bombed the Chinese embassy, killing 3 Chinese journalists. China was arguably already the fiercest critic of the bombing and was deeply enraged by this, causing tensions between it and the United States.
Protests around the world, Russia is calling this barbaric. Could this derail the diplomatic efforts you're making toward a peace deal?
Well, it wasn't barbaric. What is barbaric is what Mr. Milosevic has done. It's tragic, it's awful, but it's a tragedy, and it was an accident. What is barbaric is the intentional ethnic cleansing that he has provoked for a decade now. First in Bosnia, where 250,000 people lost their lives and 2.5 million people were made refugees, and now here. That is what is barbaric. And that's what I would urge everyone to think about here. You know, I'd like to see a few more demonstrations against the helpless, the treatment against the helpless Kosovars. I don't blame people for being upset about it. I'm upset about it. But it is clearly, if you remember that over 10,000 sorties have been flown here, it is obvious that the NATO, the generals and the pilots have worked very hard to avoid this. This will happen if you drop this much ordnance over this period of time. I think the campaign is necessary. And as I said, I send my regrets and my profound condolences to the leaders and the people of China.
Bill Clinton subsequently apologized for the attack. Although NATO stated the bombing of the Chinese embassy was an accident, based on an outdated map provided by the CIA. In the book Media Lies and the Conquest of Kosovo, it was pointed out that Western diplomats met at the Chinese embassy all the time, and there was no way the CIA, the world's most efficient intelligence agency, somehow did not possess a recent map of Belgrade, which they could have bought for $1, further evident that they had agents in Yugoslavia at the time. The attack was most likely meant to intimidate China. Later that month, NATO bombed another convoy of Albanian refugees, and there was no signs that the conflict was coming to an end. And then, it was May 26, 1999, during the bombing, that the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, or ICITY, issued an indictment against Yugoslav President Slobodan Milosevic. The first time a sitting head of state was charged with war crimes. Another interesting aspect of the Kosovo War, particularly during the bombing, was the limited use of the communist-era bunkers built in Albania during the Hoxha regime. During cross-border shelling incidents by the Yugoslav armies, several Albanian civilians would use these bunkers as shelters, and then sometimes the KLA would use these for defensive positions. In one instance, NATO warplanes accidentally bombed one of these bunkers that was sheltering KLA guerrillas. And with there being no signs of conflict coming to an end, some in the alliance, particularly the British, were considering a ground operation, which Bill Clinton would have reluctantly gone along with, while Germany, France, and Italy ruled it out entirely, calculating they would need at least 500,000 NATO troops to swiftly defeat the Yugoslav military forces. When it became obvious the bulk of these forces would consist of American forces, Bill Clinton backed down, although Blair was still preparing 50,000 British troops for a ground offensive. In May of 1999, the Battle of Kozare was still underway. The KLA had taken over part of the Albanian border and seized several outposts and a military base, but for weeks they were kept at bay by the Yugoslav army, despite massive air support from NATO and artillery support from the Albanian army. However, in early June, Milosevic agreed to a new peace proposal, and NATO started to suspend its air operations. On June 10, 1999, the Kumanovo Agreement is signed, ending the war. Serbian and Yugoslav forces will withdraw from Kosovo and will be replaced by UN peacekeepers known as the KFOR, who will disarm and disband the KLA. However, the KFOR will be led by NATO. And in accordance with UN Resolution 1244, the territorial integrity of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia will be upheld, recognizing the autonomous province of Kosovo and Metohija as a part of Yugoslavia.
Poštovani građani, agresija je završena. Mir je nadvladao nasilje. Dragi građani, srećan nam mir. U ovom trenutku naše prve misli treba da budu posvećene herojima koji su dali svoje živote u odbrani otadžbine, u borbi za slobodu i dostojanstvo svog naroda. Sva njihova imena bit će objavljena u celini, ali u ovom trenutku želim da vas obavestim da je u ratu koji je trajao tačno 11 nedelja od 24. marta do danas poginulo 462 pripadnika Vojske Jugoslavije i 114 pripadnika policije Republike Srbije. Mi nikad nećemo moći njima da se odužimo. Moramo da učinimo ono što možemo, što je naša dužnost, a to je da brinemo o njihovim porodicama i da im se odužimo time što ćemo uvek biti spremni da branimo slobodu, dostojanstvo i nezavisnost ove zemlje za koju su oni položili svoj život. Početkom ove godine širom naše zemlje bilo je mnogo mitinga. Na njima se čula jedna parola: ne damo Kosovo. Nismo dali Kosovo. Garantuje suverenitet i teritorijalni integritet naše države Grupa 8 najrazvijenijih zemalja sveta i Ujedinjene nacije. Ta garancija sadržana je i u nacrtu rezolucije. Otvorena pitanja moguće nezavisnosti Kosova u vreme koje je prethodilo agresiji zatvorena su Beogradskim dogovorom.
The next day, on June 11th, the Yugoslav military begins to withdraw from Kosovo and peacekeepers begin to enter. But much to NATO's embarrassment, some of the first peacekeepers to arrive at the Pristina airport and occupy it were Russian troops who had entered Yugoslavia from Bosnia. This later led to a tense confrontation at the airport. The Russians wanted to give their own sector of Kosovo to peacekeep, not wanting their soldiers to answer to NATO commanders. NATO refused this initially, and the Supreme Commander of NATO, Wesley Clark, went so far as to order the NATO forces to attack the Russians at the airport. Luckily, this order was refused by British General Mike Jackson, pointing out that such an act would derail the peace process and would most likely spark World War III if NATO forces violently attacked Russian troops. Afterwards, it was agreed to that the Russians would peacekeep throughout Kosovo and they would not have to answer to NATO commanders. In the weeks following, the majority of the Albanian refugees returned. However, despite the Serbian opposition begging Kosovo Serbs to remain, about 250,000 Kosovar Serbs, Gypsies, Guarani, and other non-Albanians fled Kosovo to avoid attacks and reprisal killings from vengeance-ridden Albanians. Even to this very day, 20 years later, the majority of these people have yet to return, and in the years to come, things would get a lot worse. As covered in my video on Kosovo's independence, the entrance of the KFOR did little to calm the ethnic violence and ethnic tension, as long into the early 2000s, ethnic violence against the non-Albanian population persisted, and a month after the Yugoslav troops left Kosovo, there was the murder of 14 Serbian farmers, either by the KLA or unknown Albanian extremists, in Staro Gracko on July 23, 1999. Days prior, the farmers requested KFOR protection but were denied. Throughout the second half of 1999, the destruction of Serb homes, monuments, and ancient monasteries became widespread, with the KFOR doing remarkably little to protect the Serbs and non-Albanians of Kosovo. Kosovo's Gypsy population dropped by 80% in the years following, and the Gorani, a South Slavic Muslim group that lives primarily in southern Serbia, Kosovo, and Albania, saw an aggressive assimilation campaign against them by the Albanians. In several Croatian communities, several Croatian language schools were shut down, as the KLA told them only the Albanian language would be spoken in Kosovo from now on. In addition to other non-Albanians fleeing Kosovo, an additional several thousand Albanians also fled Kosovo after the war, due to themselves being labeled collaborators by the KLA. In the aftermath of the Yugoslav forces leaving Kosovo, the KLA and other Albanian zealots carried out acts of violence against non-Albanians and Albanians who were opposed to the KLA, even in the presence of the KFOR. In Pristina, the capital of Kosovo, the KLA emptied out the hospitals of their Serb doctors and patients. The KFOR basically allowed the KLA to become the masters of post-war Kosovo, who would rule it through violence and terrorism, ethnically cleansing Kosovo of its non-Albanian population. Ending ethnic cleansing was the very purpose of intervening in Kosovo, but instead NATO allowed it to happen. Further violent incidents, including the Podevo bus bombing in February 2001, which Albanian terrorists bombed a bus full of returning Serb refugees. But back in Serbia proper, Slobodan Milosevic was ultimately overthrown by Otpor in October of 2000, a Soros and US-backed opposition front, following disputing the first round of the September 2000 presidential elections and accusations of voter fraud. In April 2001, he was arrested and then extradited to The Hague to stand trial before the ICITY and answer for war crimes. Initially wanted for crimes in Kosovo, the indictment was then expanded to the wars in Croatia and Bosnia. Milosevic died 5 years later in March 2006 while still on trial. Often called the trial of the century, the trial was ultimately ignored in the West, although still followed closely in the Balkans. His death was the ultimate convenience for the ICITY. The ICITY and the trial of Milosevic warrants its own video, and as detailed in the book Travesty, 2 simple facts can show that the ICITY is not a respectable, legitimate, or impartial court. Firstly, the prosecutor's office admits it has a special relationship with the CIA, and the indictment admittedly used American and British intelligence for its basis. The same intelligence agencies that were backing the KLA were also the same intelligence agencies providing the ICITY for information on their indictments. There are countless other things working against the tribunal's credibility, but those 2 facts alone show that the ICITY is not impartial, and why it is understandable that Yugoslavia barred the prosecutor from entering the country in 1999 and refused to cooperate with them until the Western-backed opposition came to power and passed a law of cooperation with The Hague in 2002. But the worst instance of violence in post-war Kosovo culminated in the anti-Serb pogroms of March 2004, which saw further widespread attacks against Kosovar Serbs, their homes, their churches, and monasteries, with many permanently fleeing the province. During the 2000s, the UN began working on a framework for the final status of Kosovo, spearheaded by former Finnish President Martti Ahtisaari. However, Kosovo declared independence from Serbia on February 17, 2008, the consequences of which I detailed in my Kosovo video, so we're not going to be getting into that again. So with the history put into its proper context, we have to ask the big question: why did NATO intervene against Yugoslavia in favor of the KLA in March of 1999? Firstly, let's look at the KLA angle. Were they just a ragtag band of Albanian freedom fighters that were well-armed and well-equipped in 1997 and saw their ranks grow in 1998? Yes. But after the war, it became known that Western fingerprints were all over their creation and direction. The German intelligence agency, the BND, first came to acquaint the KLA and support them, and hoped to spread German influence in the Balkans. Later, the CIA became their primary backers, having them be trained by the British SAS and American military contractors in northern Albania. During an ambush by Serbian police near the Albanian border, several French DGSE agents were killed fighting alongside KLA guerrillas. Apart from the West, the KLA allegedly received support from Al-Qaeda, and many KLA fighters trained in camps in Chechnya, which was controlled by Islamists following the First Chechen War. As per KLA's goals of forming Greater Albania, they admitted after Kosovo, the project would then expand into the Albanian-dominated regions of Montenegro, southern Serbia, and western Macedonia, and northern Greece. No method or limit to achieve these goals was off limits. For funds, they turned to human, sex, and drug trafficking, and violence was used not only against the Serbian police and military, but against Serbian civilians and ethnic Albanians who did not support the KLA. In fact, Albanian opponents of the KLA were the vast majority of their victims. The KLA are no different from other jackboot paramilitaries supported by the US, like the Contras, the right-wing Colombian militias, or the Syrian rebels. They're terroristic goons, plain and simple. Hashim Thaçi, in his early days, was hardly any better than US-backed thugs like Manuel Noriega. Admittedly, though, he's not the worst of them. That distinction goes to Ejim Janku. And make no mistake, Thaçi, if you step out of line like Noriega did, the US will find a way to take you down as well. The KLA's purpose was to incite violence and provoke a harsh Serbian response so NATO can intervene and bring the province into its domain, which is exactly what happened. Moving on, the bombing campaign supporters give this doctrine the Orwellian phrase, humanitarian bombing. The phrase has since been revised to something a little bit more benign sounding, humanitarian intervention. The claim being that, like in the previous Yugoslav wars, the Serbs were conducting genocide and or ethnic cleansing against non-Serbs, this time against the Albanian majority population of Kosovo, in order to create a greater Serbian nation-state that would be led by the ultra-nationalistic strawman, Slobodan Milosevic. But like the Iraq War that followed it, the NATO bombing was yet another conflict where the US and its Western cohorts entered under false pretenses. In fact, the entire Western narrative on the breakup of Yugoslavia is a false one. In her book, Fool's Crusade, author Diana Johnson sums it up as following. Yugoslavia was a prison of peoples. Where the Serbs oppressed all the others, it was destroyed by the rise of an evil leader, Slobodan Milosevic, who set out to create a greater Serbia by eliminating other peoples in the process called ethnic cleansing. Those other peoples sought to escape by creating their own independent states. The Yugoslav army, actually Serbian, invaded them. In Bosnia, the invading Serbs tried to drive out the Muslims who wanted to perpetuate an exemplary multi-ethnic society. Serb ethnic cleansing killed 200,000 unarmed Muslims, while the international community looked on and even prevented the Muslims from arming in self-defense. At Srebrenica, the United Nations allowed the Serbs to commit genocide. Only US bombing forced Milosevic to come to the negotiating table at Dayton. The resulting agreement brought peace and democracy to multi-ethnic Bosnia. However, the international community had failed to save the Albanian majority in Kosovo from apartheid. In 1998, Madeleine Albright warned that NATO must intervene to keep Milosevic from, quote, doing in Kosovo what he could no longer get away with in Bosnia, end quote. In January 1999, Serbian security forces massacred the defenseless civilians in the Kosovo village of Ratchak, awakening the NATO government to the need to act to stop genocide. After the turning point of Ratchak, the Serbs were summoned to peace negotiations in Rambouillet, in France. Milosevic stubbornly refused to negotiate. NATO had no choice but to start bombing Yugoslavia. Masses of Albanians were deliberately driven out according to a preconceived plan called Operation Horseshoe. Finally, Milosevic gave in, and NATO liberated the Kosovars from their oppressors. Conclusion: from now on, humanitarian intervention constitutes a principal mission for NATO, as the military arm of the international community henceforth committed to the protection of human rights. But ignoring the general Yugoslav narrative, let's look particularly at the core claims to the bombing in Kosovo, that despite being illegal, it was still legitimate, because it was necessary to prevent genocide and the ethnic cleansing in Kosovo. During the bombing, Bill Clinton and NATO initially claimed that over 100,000 Albanians had been killed or missing, and this was all part of a Serbian plan called Operation Horseshoe, a plan devised to kill or expel Kosovo's Albanian population and cement Serbian dominance over the province. Furthermore, since March 1998, a humanitarian crisis was unfolding in Kosovo. Was there any truth to any of these claims? Well, after the bombing began, some 700,000 to 900,000, about 80% of the Albanians, fled Kosovo to Albania and Macedonia, while an additional few hundred thousand remained internally displaced within Yugoslavia, particularly within Kosovo itself and then within Montenegro. And of course, the Western media at this time plastered American TVs with stories from Albanian refugees bawling, heart-wrenching stories of the Serb forces coming into their village, kicking everyone out of their homes and burning the place down, maybe killing a few people in the process. And of course, yeah, it was true, during the bombing you did see Serbian crimes at their worst. The biggest massacre of the war being the Meha massacre occurring in late April 1999, when some 370 Albanians were killed in Meha, and their bodies were taken back to Serbia proper and buried near police training grounds. But the key words here are, after the bombing began. Something Chomsky noted on the I-City indictment on Slobodan Milosevic.
Milosevic was committed many crimes. Not a nice person, terrible person. But the charges against him would never have held up. He was originally indicted on the Kosovo charges. The indictment was issued right in the middle of the bombing, which already nullifies it. They admittedly used British and U.S. intelligence. This is right in the middle of the bombing. Can't possibly take seriously. However, if you look at the indictment, it was for crimes committed after the bombing. There's one exception, Vracek. Well, let's even grant that the claims are true. Let's put it aside. All right, so there was one exception, no evidence that he was involved or what took place, but almost the entire indictment was for after the bombing. How are those charges going to stand up unless you put Bill Clinton and Tony Blair on the dock alongside him? Then they realized that was a weak case, so they added the early Balkan wars.
The point of the bombing was to prevent the Serbs from committing ethnic cleansing and genocide. And yet, if we were to be honest, it appears the bombings made things worse. In fact, let's look at things before the bombings because they tell a very different story. First, let's look at the instance of mass killings. In 1998, you only had one significant instance of the Serbian police deliberately killing a sizable number of Albanian civilians, the Gorna Obrihine massacre, which we covered. And this massacre was carried out in retaliation for the killings of Serb policemen, which suggests these were hasty and impulsive as opposed to being systemic and premeditated by the higher-ups. On the KLA side, however, their massacres stand a bit higher. Throughout the summer of 1998, the KLA killed up to 34 civilians, mostly Serbs, some Gypsies, and even some Albanians, and disposed of their bodies at the lake Radonec. In July 1998, the KLA tried to attack the town of Orahavac. During the counterattack by the Yugoslav army, they abducted 100 Serb civilians, at least 40 of whom were murdered afterwards. And when the KLA was driven from the town by the Yugoslav army, the KLA proceeded to attack Serb villages in the surrounding area and kidnap and kill even more of them. With 22 kidnapped Serbs at Kleka, where the KLA burned the bodies of their victims in an incinerator. Before burning the bodies, they raped several women and mutilated some of their victims while they were still alive. In addition to this, and up until the Yugoslav army's counteroffensive in late summer 1998, the KLA ran the Lapušnik prison camp, a concentration camp where they murdered at least some 23 civilians, including Serbs and Albanian opponents of the KLA. In fact, when discussing the terms of displacement caused by the conflict, the majority of those who fled Kosovo from March 1998 to January 1999 were not Albanians fleeing the Serbian paramilitaries or security forces, but were Serbs and other non-Albanians fleeing the KLA, some 30 to 60,000 people, as the majority of the Albanians displaced at this time were displaced within Kosovo. This also correlates with what the West admitting that prior to January 1999, the majority of civilian deaths, including most Albanian civilian deaths in Kosovo, were caused by the KLA, not the Serbian security forces. I mean, sure, even at this time the Serbs committed crimes too, but these were limited to a few extrajudicial killings, the burning and looting of a few villages, but not on a scale that warranted international attention, let alone intervention. In fact, it was observed that the Serbian security counterinsurgency operations' peak intensity was in the summer of 1998, so not even after the collapse of their ceasefire in December did they resume to that level. In fact, an early 1999 report from the German Foreign Ministry gave an analysis of the situation in Kosovo that defied conventional wisdom in the West by advising the courts to turn down asylum requests from Albanians, reading, quote, "The entire action of the Yugoslav military and police since February 1998 was directed against separatist activities and does not indicate the persecution of the whole ethnic group of Albanians, whether in Kosovo as a whole or in parts of the province. A state program of persecution directed against the whole ethnic group of Albanians has not existed and does not exist."
Die Legitimationsgrundlage für die deutsche Beteiligung war die sogenannte humanitäre Katastrophe. Eine solche humanitäre Katastrophe als völkerrechtliche Kategorie, die einen Kriegseintritt rechtfertigte, lag vor Kriegsbeginn im Kosovo nicht vor.
Bis zum Beginn der NATO-Luftangriffe gab es keine humanitäre Krise. Sicher, es gab humanitäre Probleme und es gab viele Vertriebene durch den Bürgerkrieg. Aber das spielte sich so ab. Die Leute verließen ihre Dörfer, wenn die Serben eine Aktion gegen die UÇK durchführten und kamen danach wieder zurück. Tatsache ist, jeder wusste, dass es erst...
While NATO claimed that over 100,000 Albanians have been killed, the casualties have since then been much lower. The Humanitarian Law Center has shown that between January 1st, 1998 to December 31st, 2000, just over 8,500 Albanian civilians were killed. But since that time frame includes dates before and after the war, so the number is probably even much smaller than that, and then you have UN forensics, who personally counted only a few thousand bodies at the most, of all ethnicities. But even if the HLC's numbers are correct, it is still a far cry from the 100,000 as claimed by NATO. But what about what happened at Ratchak, the event that NATO decided that its intervention was necessary? This is arguably the most controversial event of the war. As for what exactly happened is still a subject of debate. Officially, according to the NATO and Albanian narrative, on that day, the Serbian police entered the village of Ratchak and started killing innocent people in their homes and on the street, then took an additional 20 men to a ravine and then executed them. But several things cast a reasonable shadow of doubt over this claim. According to the Serbs, the Ratchak operation was an ordinary police operation, and that the men at the ravine were placed there afterwards by the KLA. Sounds like a stretch, but let's take a look even closer. On the day after the operation, William Walker, who was heading the Kosovo verification mission, went to Ratchak alongside the KLA. He brought with him OSCE monitors and found the bodies. He then held a press conference where he accused the Serbs of carrying out a massacre. But what exactly happened the day before? Well, actually, when the Serbian police went to Ratchak, they brought along with them other OSCE monitors and even a film crew from the Associated Press, who shot footage of the battle, which you're looking at right now. In subsequent articles, they disputed the account of a senseless massacre, noticing that Ratchak was surrounded by trenches and makeshift fortifications. They also witnessed a tense battle where the police had to stay close to the walls after several hours of fighting. They then collected heavy weapons, including Chinese-made RPGs and grenades, and you're looking at the actual footage of the recovered weapons from Ratchak. And indeed, even a KLA commander at Milosevic's trial even admitted the KLA had a heavy presence at Ratchak and heavy weapons were used against the police.
Milosevic zit tegenover een commandant van het Kosovo bevrijdingsleger, Šukribuja. Op een vraag van Milosevic beschrijft Šukribuja de bewapening van zijn manschappen in en rond Ratchak.
The mortar 500 millimeters as well.
Dobro, to smo znači razjasnili. Vaše naoružanje od automatskog do teškog naoružanja. Ovo mi je drago da se razjasni, jer sve dok Avdiju Bilal iz Račka je tvrdio da su vaši pripadnici bili naoružani lovačkim puškama. Moje sljedeće pitanje glasi, vi ste po vašoj izjavi imali u Račku samo 47 vojnika. Je li to tako?
Yes, it is true that there were 47 soldiers in the positions near Ratchak.
To je znači čim jasno i tačno. Piše u 06:30 časova stavljeno je selo Račak u potpuno okruženje, otvorena je vatra iz ručnog bacača i pešadijskog naoružanja. Da li ste potvrdili, molim vas, da ste upotrebili minobacače protiv policije toga dana?
This is a report which has been produced by the police. It's merely put to you for comment. And you're being asked about the references to various weapons which it's alleged we used.
A handheld grenade launcher caliber 500 was used.
The next day, however, is when William Walker showed up and claimed that there was a massacre, and found witnesses who were willing to claim things like they were all shot in the head or were mutilated. And the Serbs went so far as to slit the victims' throats as they sang nationalistic songs. A very brutal and cartoonish image. Sounds like something ISIS would do. And so it was only natural an investigation would follow. 2 sets of autopsies on 40 out of 45 bodies were performed. The KLA took 5 of the bodies and never released them. A joint team of Belarusian and Yugoslav forensic scientists in the Yugoslav government's report, and then a Finnish report on behalf of the EU. The first report concluded that everyone who died at Ratchak was an enemy combatant, killed at a distance, and there was traces of gunpowder on their hands. The Finnish report, headed by Helena Ranta, which stressed the report was her opinion and hers alone, came to a different conclusion. They rejected the gunpowder test as being dated and claimed the people at Ratchak were killed at close range. Indeed, even to this day, Helena Ranta still stands by her original findings, although stressed that the report does not explicitly call the event a massacre, nor does it assign responsibility. But this was the report that NATO went with to conclude a massacre had occurred, and now had the casus belli to go to war with Yugoslavia if they reject their demands to send their forces into Kosovo. But over the years, new developments came to light. Firstly, in 2001, a second Finnish report was hidden by the EU until after the war, and it came out indicating different findings from the one NATO used in 1999. The results of this one were even less friendly to NATO's conclusions. This one demonstrated that most of the bodies were shot at from different angles, but only one of which they could demonstrably prove being shot at close range. But anyway, as for the civilian clothing, meaningless. The KLA did often fight wearing civilian clothing to better blend in with the civilian population. In fact, during the Battle of Bela Chavik Mine, the Western journalists there noted the KLA forces there were mostly dressed like civilians and were armed with hunting rifles. But what about the mutilations? Well, the report does not mention throats being slit, and it also notes that any sign of post-mortem mutilation most likely came from animals. But that didn't stop a couple of lying witnesses at Milosevic's trial from trying to claim that some people had their eyes and hearts cut out.
Thank you.
When they took off the head, they gouged out the eyes. I saw this in the mosque. When they took them to the mosque on the 16th, I was there, and it was the most barbaric thing that I had ever seen. Chetniks did it.
I saw the knife and saw how they ripped his heart out.
Da li vi znate da svi izveštaji koji su napravljeni o tim mrtvima govore da nijedno telo nije bilo unakaženo, a kamoli da pominju da je nekome iščupano srce iz grudi, pogotovo da je to bilo dok je bio živ i tako dalje. Zašto ste to izmislili?
In addition to these things, Helena Ranta has since admitted that several policemen were also killed at Ratchak, thereby indicating that something went down other than the Serbs just walked up and started killing people. But what about the Serbs preventing the I-City prosecutor from entering the country and seeing the massacre site? And the US claiming that they have phone intercepts in which Deputy Prime Minister Nikola Sanajevic and the Interior Ministry General Sretan Lukic wanted to quote-unquote go in hard at Ratchak, and they're wondering how they could show the bodies as being combatants instead of civilians. Well, as for blocking the I-City prosecutor, after learning how the court conducted itself, it's perfectly understandable why they didn't let the prosecutor into the country. As for the alleged phone intercepts, their value obviously isn't as solid as the US claims it was, because in the aftermath, of all the people who were initially charged with Ratchak, Sretan Lukic was not one of them, while Sanajevic was, but like everyone else charged with having a hand in Ratchak, which included Slobodan Milosevic himself as president of Yugoslavia, Milan Milutinovic, the president of Serbia, Draguljub Odanic, the chief of staff of the Yugoslav army, and Interior Minister Vlakio Stokiljanovic. The Ratchak charges were ultimately dropped from all of these people due to the lack of evidence of these individuals' involvement, which leads to yet another eyebrow-raising fact about the whole Ratchak affair. As of March 2019, we are 20 years from the massacre, a massacre that was supposedly thoroughly investigated by the OSCE on-site and then by the I-City, and this was supposedly the deciding factor for NATO to become militarily involved. And yet despite all of this, no one has ever been convicted of participating in it. Sure, other massacres of the Kosovo War have people never being charged, but for those, the participants were wearing ski masks or had black face paint. And at least some of the witnesses could name some of the people involved. In the Mayha massacre, the largest massacre of the war, there are currently 14 outstanding charges against alleged participants, one of whom killed themselves shortly after the indictments came out. But if we look at the Ratchak footage, no one is wearing a ski mask. Their faces are visible. These men can be identified. And they probably know which police units were involved and the men who were there on that day. They were able to find at least one man who was. Zoran Stanovic was a Serb policeman who was initially convicted by a UN court in Pristina in 2001 for participating in the massacre. But the UN later ruled he did not receive a fair trial, noting none of the witnesses provided the same story, and when the judges wanted to dismiss the case, they are pressured and intimidating into pursuing it. Stojanovic was ultimately pardoned in 2007 by then Serbian President Boris Tadic. Interestingly, during the investigation into his alleged participation, a recreation of the events at Ratchak was prevented twice, not by Serbs, but a group of armed Albanians the first time and then an angry mob by the second time. I mean, come on! If this man was guilty and the Serbs really did kill people, then why did the Albanians prevent the recreation? As of right now, there are no new investigations taking place and no pending charges against any alleged participants. As I see it, from here on out, no one will ever be charged, let alone convicted, for killing people at Ratchak. Why? Because they would have to prove in court that a massacre happened, which they'd have a hard, if not impossible, time of doing. So it's better to let the narrative sit as it is and not follow up on it. As for Walker, the man who let the world know of this event, a look into his past shows he is a shady character who most certainly pushed the massacre narrative with ulterior motives. For one, Helena Ranta even admitted that Walker once tried to coerce her into making the details of her report more explicit, with him snapping pencils when she refused. As for his past, in the 1980s, Walker spent time in El Salvador, serving as its ambassador from 1988 to 1992. There, he helped the Salvadorian government cover up crimes committed by right-wing death squads, which, like the KLA, were covertly sponsored by the United States. Furthermore, like UNSCOM, as covered in my retrospective on Iraq, it turned out once again that in Kosovo, many of these so-called monitors working under Walker were in fact Western intelligence agents, particularly CIA agents and members of the MPRI. Walker was supposed to be a neutral agent, but he was obviously still acting for the United States. From Ratchak, he called both Wesley Clark, the Supreme Commander of NATO, and Richard Holbrooke from his satellite phone, something he tried to lie about afterwards. Am I saying the Ratchak massacre was staged by the KLA? Yes, I believe that. At the very worst, the Serb police may have carried out an otherwise legitimate raid on the village and maybe summarily executed a few people who happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time, but that's not what's being alleged. It was alleged that the Serbian police, after suffering some casualties in the area surrounding Ratchak a few days prior, decided to carry out a bloodthirsty retribution attack that involved the murdering of 45 civilians, but that doesn't appear to be the case, to me at least, and others. In the German documentary It Began With a Lie, it documented another instance of the KLA trying to stage another massacre, this time on the outskirts of Pristina 2 weeks later.
Deshalb führen wir Krieg, titelte auch die Presse und veröffentlichte die Bilder Scharpings. Doch seine eigenen Experten wussten es schon damals besser. Dies war kein Massaker an Zivilisten. Aus dem geheimen Lagebericht.
Verschlusssache. Nur für den Dienstgebrauch. Am 29. Januar 1999 wurden in Rugoro bei einem Gefecht 24 Kosovo-Albaner und ein serbischer Polizist getötet.
Also ein Gefecht? Kein Massaker an Zivilisten, wie der Verteidigungsminister behauptet. Diese Fernsehbilder, aufgenommen von einem westlichen Kamerateam unmittelbar nach den Ereignissen in Rugovo, liefern Hinweise, wie es tatsächlich war. Gewehre neben toten Albanern, die angeblich Zivilisten waren. Die Toten tragen Militärstiefel. Sie haben Mitgliedsausweise der UCK und tragen deren Rangabzeichen.
Aside from the lack of a humanitarian crisis did come about after the bombs began to fall, and this is where you saw the mass exodus of Kosovar Albanians, while the massacres against them escalated. But was this proof of Operation Horseshoe, the plan to expel the Albanians? No. After the war, Operation Horseshoe was exposed as an intelligence fabrication from Germany. Heinz Lokai, a retired German brigadier general, stated that it was initially an observation of Yugoslav military movements by Bulgarian intelligence, which was then turned into a definite plan to expel Kosovo's entire Albanian population by the German Defense Ministry, but ultimately that the Bulgarians concluded that the Serbian objective was to eliminate the KLA, not expel the entire Albanian population.
Ich habe dann um ein Gespräch im Verteidigungsministerium nachgesucht. Das habe ich bekommen, das war im November. Und dort hat man mir gesagt, es habe kein Operationsplan Hufeisen vorgelegen, sondern was man hatte, war eine Darstellung der Ereignisse, die im Kosovo abgelaufen sind. Und diese Darstellung der Ereignisse konnte man aufgrund der OSZE Berichte und andere Berichte nachvollziehen. Aber es gab keinen Operationsplan Hufeisen, so jedenfalls die Fachleute im Verteidigungsministerium.
Milosevic had always denied seeking to expel the Albanians, stating that the majority of crimes were carried out mostly by the paramilitaries and rogue elements of the police and military in the rural areas of Kosovo. In fact, during his trial at The Hague, The prosecution admitted it could not produce a single order from Milosevic to commit atrocities. Furthermore, Radomir Markovic, the former head of state security who testified for the prosecution, and former Yugoslav president Zoran Lilic both testified that there was no official plan to expel the Kosovo Albanians. So what caused the majority of Albanians to flee Kosovo? It was, in fact, the NATO bombs.
Zu einer humanitären Krise kommen würde, wenn die NATO bombardiert. Das wurde diskutiert. In der NATO, der OSZE, bei uns vor Ort und in der Bevölkerung.
Evident that only a handful had fled Yugoslavia altogether by March 1999, sure, many most likely did flee in panic of intensified military operations and the brutality of the paramilitaries. But you also have to note, if the bombings weren't a factor, then why did NATO order all OSCE monitors out of Kosovo days before the bombs began to fall? As did other international NGOs in Kosovo, they told their people to leave. If the bombing wasn't a major factor, then why did they have to leave? But didn't the ICD find that the Serbs did intentionally drive out the Albanians? But that is only because they refused to even allow the factor of NATO bombing be brought up in court.
Da li je bilo potpuno jasno da oni u to vreme nisu bežali, bio organizovan neki proces njihove deportacije od strane vlasti?
Well, I'm not sure this witness can answer that. He wasn't there at the time. It is a crucial issue which the trial chamber will have to determine, and his opinion on it may not assist.
Ja ne pitam svedoka, gospodine May, za mišljenje, nego za činjenice koje su mu u to vreme bio potpredsjednik vlade.
He can't say as to the facts. And as I say, that's a matter we're going to have to decide.
Dobro, gospodine Liliću, da li imate saznanja o tome zašto su Albanci postali izbjeglice?
No, I'm not going to allow that question.
Gospodine May, izgleda da su pitanja dozvoljena kad se dovede neki svedok koji je negde u nekom selu u Bosni nešto čuo i video, a nisu dozvoljena pitanja kad se dovede bivši predsjednik Jugoslavije i tadašnji potpredsjednik Savezne vlade o stvarima za koje je krajnje kompetentan da odgovori.
Furthermore, in a Guardian interview, one KLA commander even admitted that KLA was able to get several 100,000 Albanians to leave Kosovo on their advice, straight from the horse's mouth. In my estimation, the Serbian counterinsurgency operations in Kosovo were probably no more criminal than Operation Storm, the final operation of the Croatian Independence War in which the Croatian army launched a massive offensive on the Serb-dominated region of Croatia, Serbian Krajina, in August 1995. Just after 4 days, 200,000 Serbs fled the region, and in the aftermath there were some killings, lootings, and burnings of Serb homes and villages, but nothing considered systemic. The Croatian government subsequently arrested over 2,000 persons suspected of crimes in connection to Operation Storm. After the war in 1999, the Serbian government arrested around 2,700 people in connection to crimes relating to Kosovo. In fact, during the war, even the ICD noted that the Yugoslav military did arrest people and sentence them for crimes committed against Albanians. But was this good enough for them? Of course not. Aside from the dubious claims about the ethnic conflict, it can be demonstrated that NATO was not serious about trying to end the conflict through peaceful means and protect Albanians. There were several motives in NATO's decision to attack Yugoslavia. The supposed plight of Kosovar Albanians was not one of them. They weren't even looking for a peaceful way to end the conflict. In fact, let's take a look at the so-called negotiations at Rambouillet. At Rambouillet, the narrative was that the NATO countries oversaw negotiations between the Albanians and Serbs who came to a reasonable agreement, which was stubbornly rejected by the Serbs, who exhausted all diplomatic solutions to end the war peacefully. This was found in the so-called Independent Commission, which admittedly 7 out of 11 seats were staffed by NATO countries. But the reality is that, from the outside looking in, it appears the Rambouillet talks were meant to fail by design, not because the Serbs were being stubborn, but because NATO deliberately set the bar too high for the Serbs to accept. At the negotiations, the Albanians and Serbs didn't even speak directly with each other. They interacted with NATO representatives as middlemen. For one, the proposal would allow NATO to establish Kosovo as a protectorate and grant it de facto sovereignty, completely reworking its autonomy and economic system, and allowing it to have a president and a prime minister. The Serbs interpret this as paving the way for Kosovo's eventual separation from Yugoslavia, especially with the words towards the end of the document, where it adds, after 3 years, the final status of Kosovo will be determined by the United Nations and the will of the people. So while making nominal references to Yugoslavia's territorial integrity, this clause alone was a way to slip probable independence through the back door. The agreement also made no explicit mention of disarming the KLA, only the demilitarization of quote-unquote other forces. But the real crux came from Appendix B, which allowed NATO to not only demand the right to keep troops in Kosovo, but would allow NATO free passage and occupy all of Yugoslavia, being allowed unrestricted access to its airspace, its ports, its unrestricted movement throughout the country, and its immunity for NATO personnel from Yugoslavian law. The occupation part alone is something that no country on earth would have ever agreed to. No leader with a spine would have accepted this. As Henry Kissinger of all people put it, the Rambouillet text, which called on Serbia to admit NATO troops throughout Yugoslavia, was a provocation, an excuse to start bombing. Rambouillet is a document that no angelic Serb could have accepted. It was a terrible diplomatic document that should have never been presented in that form. Even Bill Clinton supposedly admitted years later that if he was in Milosevic's place, he would not have signed the Rambouillet agreement either. Really makes you think. The Kumanovo Agreement and Resolution 1244, on the other hand, which ended the war, rectified the egregious provisions at Rambouillet. It explicitly guaranteed Yugoslavia's territorial integrity, explicitly demanded the disarming of the KLA, and that the NATO presence in Kosovo would be strictly limited to Kosovo alone, and it would be under a UN banner. The truth is, NATO had no intention of solving the crisis through peaceful means. For one, George Kenny, a State Department specialist on Yugoslavia, admitted that NATO set the bar higher than the Serbs could accept, as the Serbs needed a little bombing to see reason. The truth of the matter is that Milosevic and the Serbs were more willing to solve the conflict through peaceful means. On another interesting note to stress that, contrary to the Western propaganda that the Serbs were being monolithic and ethnocentric, the Yugoslav delegation at Rambouillet, much to the shock of Western diplomats, was ethnically diverse, including not only Serbs and Montenegrins, but Albanians, Turks, and Gypsies, while the KLA delegation, on the other hand, was exclusively Albanian.
On one side, you had a delegation of Serbia composed of everybody who was living in Kosovo and who lives in Kosovo, representatives of all national communities. Serbs, Albanians, Turks, Muslims, Gypsy, Egyptians, Goranci, all 7 of different national communities were represented in the delegation. On the other side, delegation of separation movement, purely Albanian. And that's something which can explain the major differences in our approach. Our approach from the very beginning of talks was that Kosovo problem can be solved on the basis of principle of equality of all citizens living in the region and of equality of all national communities living in the region. So our approach is multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-religious, insisting upon equality of national communities, regardless to their number.
The Yugoslavs were willing to agree to a peace plan that included a range of autonomy that all ethnic groups in Kosovo could agree upon, and unarmed UN observers to oversee its implementation. When this seemed unlikely, the Serbs were willing to even give more concessions, such as the full restoration of Kosovo's pre-1990 autonomy and lightly armed UN observers from neutral countries like Ireland or Finland, so long as they didn't have things like tanks or APCs. The Rambouillet Agreement was NATO's way of trying to strong-arm Yugoslavia into bending to its will. The agreement itself was in violation of the Helsinki Accords in 1980, which explicitly forbids countries from trying to force other countries into accepting treaties under the threat of force, which is exactly what NATO was trying to do. It was an ultimatum. Sign this agreement or we will bomb you. So how about how NATO conducted the war? They say that the war was conducted in order to protect Albanians, so naturally would we see the bombing limited to targeting Yugoslav military units in Kosovo, right? As shown previously, no. Serbia proper was bombed extensively, and strikes against Montenegro occurred, but were limited as to not lower the popularity of Montenegro's anti-Milosevic president, Milo Đukanović. But one of the most horrific events of NATO's bombing campaign happened not in Kosovo, but in the city of Novi Sad, the capital of Vojvodina, more than 200 miles away from Kosovo. Apart from bombing bridges, NATO itself caused a humanitarian and certainly an environmental crisis by bombing the city's oil refineries, burning hundreds of thousands of carcinogens over the city, well above the legally permitted limit. This caused serious pollution and ecological damage. NATO also bombed several TV stations, electrical installations, residential areas, and cut off the city's power and water supply. The devastation of Novi Sad clearly disproportionately impacted the civilian living conditions more than they did the Yugoslavs' military ability to wage war on Kosovo. I dare anyone tell me with a straight face that the devastation of Novi Sad was somehow necessary to prevent ethnic violence in Kosovo. Novi Sad is just the worst example. Other towns and cities had similar infrastructure bombed by NATO. Hospitals, schools, you name it. While the civilian casualties were initially low early on, as the bombing intensified, so too did the number of casualties. NATO began to show a rather blatant disregard for civilian losses. The Intercept published the transcript moments before an F-16 bombed one of the Albanian refugee convoys. In it, the pilot tries to tell his superior that it looked more like a civilian convoy with no tanks or armored vehicles present, but the commander furiously told him it was obviously a Serbian military target and told him to bomb it anyway. After this and many other incidents, NATO, in a breathtaking display of cowardice, refused to take responsibility for what it called collateral damage, and had the gall to try to blame the Serbs for NATO's own fuck-ups, claiming, the refugees were chased there by the Serbs, or in Novi Sad, the Serbs were using human shields. At least when the Dutch Royal Air Force bombed the hospital in Niš by accident with cluster bombs, they took the precaution of no longer using them, but that didn't stop the rest of NATO from using them. In fact, as pointed out in the book Media Lies, cluster bombs are generally designed for destroying vehicles and inflict casualties on personnel, and are generally used for terror bombing. While apparently useful in destroying things like runways, and the Niš bombing's target was the airport, Amnesty International pointed out that such weapons are too risky to use in a populated area like Niš. To further highlight NATO's blatant disregard for civilian casualties contradicting their own claims of waging a humanitarian war, the Belgian Chief of Staff, General Herdelier, went so far as claiming, maybe we should make the bombings felt by hurting the Serb population itself. Let's inflict losses on them. Let us hit them where they are comfortable. The greatest catastrophe would not be any loss of life. It would instead be if the NATO operation turned out to be a failure. That is a bold way to contradict Solona and Clinton's claim that this wasn't a war against the Yugoslav people. This straight up admitting that it was now. I mean, if Sesel's vague comment about NATO bombings would make things worse for the Albanians is indicative that the Yugoslav government was waging a war of ethnic cleansing, then Herdelier's comment provides even more damning evidence that NATO was waging a war not against Milosevic, but the Yugoslav people as well. Wesley Clark even stated that NATO's mission was to demolish, destroy, devastate, degrade, and ultimately eliminate the essential infrastructure of Milosevic's war machine, which is military speak for we're going to destroy the Serbian economy. Because as pointed out that during the bombing of Yugoslavia, NATO made no distinction between civilian and military targets. What did this infrastructure for Milosevic's war machines include? Apparently automobile factories, cigarette factories, pharmaceutical plants, textile factories, TV and radio transmitters, bridges, and even shoe factories. In an interview, Spanish pilots admitted that they had been ordered to bomb civilian targets, and when their superiors refused to give these orders, they were sacked by NATO's higher-ups. Why were they bombing infrastructure and economic targets? Because it was a way to demoralize the Yugoslav people into accepting capitulation and punish Yugoslavia for not being subservient to the whims of Western elites. In the end, just over 500 civilians were killed in the bombing, and tens of billions of dollars worth of losses were inflicted on the Yugoslav economy, practically destroying it. At one point during the bombing, NATO even tried to assassinate Milosevic himself by bombing his personal residence. Now we'll get into why NATO truly bombed Yugoslavia. The answer is really quite simple. Western domination. Contrary to the Western lies that Slobodan Milosevic was the butcher of the Balkans, who was solely responsible for dismembering Yugoslavia in order to create a greater Serbia, it was actually the West themselves who sought to dismember Yugoslavia, particularly the United States and Germany, to turn the former Yugoslav republics into client states for the West, by backing the separatist governments in Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, and Macedonia, and further backed separatist elements within the rump Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, such as the Albanian separatists in Kosovo, and Montenegrin separatists in Montenegro, such as Đukanović. As mentioned in my first video on Kosovo, many of the former Yugoslav republics joined NATO in 2004 and 2009, turning much of the Balkans into NATO territory, and virtually all of it by 2017, with Montenegro becoming a member. Of course, NATO has been expanding increasingly into Eastern Europe as a means to encircle Russia. The Balkans were particularly strategic because it further cut off any potential Russian access to the Mediterranean. Serbia in particular is the most pro-Russian Balkan state due to their shared culture and history of Russian support for Serbia. Since Milosevic was ousted from power in 2000, the Serbian government has pivoted towards a pro-Western direction in hopes of making things better for themselves, but as demonstrated, the opposite occurred. Montenegro and Kosovo broke away in 2006 and 2008 respectively, and Serbia has since then largely become subservient to the European Union and the West as a whole, with Western elites propping up pro-Western politicians in Serbia, and the Serbs kidding themselves that this will somehow get them Kosovo back. It won't. Serbia's current diplomatic stance is enough to show that the West has succeeded in bringing the entire Balkan region into its sphere of influence. And with the rest of Eastern Europe in the Western sphere of influence, the West's next move in the 2000s, which was ironically exposed by Wesley Clark, move into the Middle East to take out the former Soviet client states like Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Iran. And this was necessary to install pro-American and pro-Western governments to deny potential allies to the next superpower. In medial eyes, the Caucasus region, which holds a lot of the world's oil, would become next in the West's crosshairs, with Azerbaijan and Georgia being critical locations to bring oil from the Caspian Sea to Europe. The book arguably predicted the 2008 war in South Ossetia, noting that the pipelines covered in my video in that conflict were vital to bypassing Russia to bring oil to the West. The ex-Soviet republics are the final step for NATO's encirclement of Russia, especially the Central Asian countries, which are also rich in natural resources and raw materials. So what can we learn from the bombing? Once again, we can learn that the NATO attack on Yugoslavia is yet another example of the US and its Western cohorts undermining international law to achieve their own political ends. This time branding their aggression as humanitarian, trying to compare Milosevic and the Serbs to Hitler and the Nazis. Noam Chomsky, a Jewish man, considered this claim historical revisionism, almost tantamount to Holocaust denial. For one, European Jews did not have an armed group that was backed by Western intelligence agencies, attacking German police stations and Wehrmacht bases to form a new Jewish state within Germany, and was subject to legitimate counterinsurgency operations. After the war in Kosovo, the Iraq War was sold on the premise that they have WMDs, but as soon as it was discovered there were no WMDs, public opinion turned against the war. But when waged as humanitarian, support for the war goes up. The Naira testimony, although later shown to be fraudulent, pushed hard public opinion in favor of the Gulf War, and sob stories from Albanian refugees pushed public opinion in favor of the war in Kosovo. Although when it was found out that NATO was causing civilian deaths, public opinion for it began to drop. The humanitarian angle has been used since Kosovo, and that was NATO's justification for taking out Gaddafi in 2011 in Libya, even though Gaddafi hadn't attacked or threatened any NATO member state. And the humanitarian angle is the excuse they were trying to get to depose Assad in Syria, with them faking chemical weapons attacks just like the KLA faked a few massacres in Kosovo. And it is now safe to bet that humanitarian concerns will be the casus belli for intervening in Venezuela. But as demonstrated, the doctrine of illegal but legitimate is a false one. As pointed out, if that is how NATO really felt, then why didn't they push for a new international treaty allowing countries to wage war on each other in the name of humanitarianism? Well, it's because it could come back to bite them in the ass, that's why. The intervention further emboldened Albanian separatism in the region. Immediately after the war in Kosovo, KLA veterans tried to spread the project for Greater Albania into the Kosovo Valley, an Albanian majority region to Serbia proper just outside of Kosovo, and the goals were the same: incite rebellion for further NATO intervention and join the region with Kosovo. However, this failed, and NATO allowed the Yugoslav army to enter the buffer zone established after the war, and allowed the militants to surrender to KFOR if they handed over their names and weapons. And then starting in January 2001, former KLA insurgents helped form the Macedonian branch of the UCK in waging an armed insurgency against Macedonia. The conflict ended peacefully with the Ohrid Agreement in August 2001, although on and off clashes persisted until November of that year, and once in a while you'll hear of Albanian separatists clashing with police in Macedonia, most recently in 2015 in Kumanovo. Unrelated to Albanian separatists, in August of 1999 the Second Chechen War broke out between the Russian military and the breakaway region of Chechnya, which had become dominated by Islamist warlords. In October 1999, facing a Russian ground assault on the region, Chechen President Aslan Mashkadov called for NATO intervention in the conflict. And of course, this didn't happen for obvious reasons. As for this biting the West back in the ass, as previously covered in my retrospective on the South Ossetia War, Russia invaded Georgia in August 2008 using humanitarian concerns of the Ossetian people as their reason for attacking, which the West, of course, condemned. Apart from that, Noam Chomsky particularly highlighted NATO's hypocrisy, claiming, "Oh, how could we allow this at the doorsteps of NATO?" And yet, the NATO countries remained silent to the much worse atrocities that the Turks, a NATO member, were carrying out against their Kurdish population. At the same time as the Yugoslav wars, the Turks, in their campaign to stop the PKK, or the Kurdistan Workers' Party, a far-left Kurdish militant group waging a separatist insurgency against the Turkish state, the Turks decided to destroy thousands of Kurdish villages using right-wing death squads such as the Grey Wolves to terrorize the population, and of course the Turkish security forces would massacre Kurdish civilians and try to pass them off as terrorists. This was happened in the borders of NATO, but instead of trying to stop the Turks from doing this, the United States even assisted them in providing them with weaponry. Hypocrisy aside, what if we were to permit unilateral intervention on humanitarian grounds? Well, a little over 3 years ago in December 2015, a Muslim military alliance was formed to combat ISIS. But what if they decide to stick around after ISIS has been defeated? And what if Israel decided to launch another brutal war against the Palestinians, and reports of the atrocity started to come out? Would this alliance have the right to attack Israel under humanitarian pretexts? Does Russia or China have the right to attack the United States because of the perception that the US treats its black population inhumanely? No, they don't, and NATO had no right to attack Yugoslavia in 1999, violating international law, and violating its own charter, which states that the alliance's purposes is strictly defensive and adheres to international law, which during their 50th anniversary summit in April 1999, as the bombing was going on, was revised because the US will be damned to let a pesky thing like international law get in its way. Lastly, the doctrine of humanitarian concerns and the demonization of Milosevic as Hitler is above all ironic in one very damning sense. The last surviving prosecutor of the Nuremberg trials, Walter Rockler, turned out to be a fierce critic of the bombing campaign, pointing out that Bill Clinton and NATO were waging the exact same kind of war the Nazis were prosecuted for.
The question becomes, given the alleged purity of NATO motives, having the objective of assuring truth, freedom, and the American way, was this bombing subject to any censure under international law? The short answer is that the bombing was an act in flagrant contempt of international law and criminal under that law. As a primary source of international law, the judgment of the Nuremberg Tribunal in the 1945-46 case of the major Nazi war criminals is plain and clear. American and British leaders often rhetorically invoke and praise that judgment, but they obviously have not read it. The International Court declared, and I quote, "To initiate a war of aggression, therefore, is not only an international crime, it is the supreme international crime, differing only from other war crimes in that it contains within itself the accumulated evil of the whole," end quote. At Nuremberg, the United States and Britain, particularly, pressed the prosecution of Nazi leaders for planning and initiating aggressive war as the ultimate crime. Supreme Court Justice, United States, Robert Jackson, the head of the American prosecution staff, asserted that launching a war of aggression is a crime and that no political or economic situation can justify it. The General Assembly of the UN, in Resolution 2131, which is a, quote, declaration on the inadmissibility of intervention, unquote, reinforced the view that a forceful military intervention in any country is aggression and a crime without justification. Putting a NATO label on aggressive policy and conduct does not give that conduct any sanctity. Today, I cannot be persuaded that random destruction and killing in Yugoslavia by strong powers against the weak was anything less than killing in the service of arrogance, and I repudiate the shabby pretext for this criminal conduct.
What many people fail to realize at Nuremberg was although genocide and other crimes against humanity were horrific, they were ultimately symptoms of the worst crime of all, the crimes against peace, which the Nazis committed by aggressively violating the sovereignty of the nations they invaded, and that is exactly what NATO was doing against Yugoslavia in 1999. In a final note, according to Russian President Vladimir Putin, NATO's attacking of Yugoslavia in 1999 dispelled any illusions for Russia that NATO and the West could be trusted. At first, Russia was promised that NATO would not expand eastward after the reunification of Germany, but when they protested the expansion of NATO, it was told that the promise wasn't valid because it was an oral agreement. And so expand it did, adding insult to injury by inviting former Warsaw Pact members to join the alliance. And then it demonstrated that NATO does not care about international law and will use false pretenses to justify military force against countries that stand in its way, despite claiming to be a defensive alliance. And when oral agreements fail, the West can't even be trusted to adhere to what's on paper, violating international law when using military force, and then recognizing Kosovo as an independent state, despite Resolution 1244 affirming Kosovo as an integral part of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, now Serbia, its successor state. Russia now sees an alliance with itself in the crosshairs of NATO, and is now lashing out itself violating international law in order to defend themselves, increasing tensions, and with increased tensions increases the risks of war and confrontation. Wrapping up, this is one of the longest one of these I ever did. But as you see, I am passionate. I've been a staunch proponent of non-interventionism for some time. I'm not a big fan of NATO or US foreign policy in general, and as a pan-Slavist, NATO's intervention infuriated me even more, siding with non-Slavs. But I am not a Serb. I'm a Polish American. And what the Serbs had to endure makes me feel for them. And I hope, if you're not very familiar with the conflicts, this has opened your eyes a bit. I am 25 years old, and for those of us who are still young, we still have a lifetime ahead of us, in which we will see wars be waged in the name of humanitarianism, but are ultimately waged with ulterior motives in mind. And we need to use these cases as a lessons in order to challenge them when those wars come. Until then, I am the Black Lord of Fenrir. Stay tuned for more videos. The finale Spawnathon will be next.